November 14th, 1942. Iron Bottom Sound. The sea is black and heavy, rolling beneath a sky with no moon to guide it. Only the dim red glow of instruments inside USS Washington breaks the darkness. Men speak in low, controlled tones, aware that somewhere ahead, beyond the curtain of tropical night, a Japanese bombardment force is closing in on Guadalcanal. Their purpose is simple and deadly: silence Henderson Field before dawn. Rain drifts across the water in thin sheets, carried by shifting winds. Through the haze, operators in Washington's radar plot room watch blips crawl across the green-lit screen. Contacts, still too distant for the naked eye, but unmistakably there. A battle line forming, a threat advancing. On the surface, the battleship moves in near silence, its massive hull cutting a clean path through the dark. Deep within the plotting rooms, the countdown begins as technicians feed range, speed, and bearing into the fire control computers. 7 minutes. That is the margin before the guns can speak. 7 minutes before steel and electronics reshape a night long dominated by Japanese night fighting doctrine. That margin, narrow yet decisive, emerged from months of attrition and shifting power across the Pacific. Events whose weight now pressed toward this silent approach. By late 1942, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined by exhaustion, uncertainty, and the relentless pull of unfinished battles. The initial shock of Japanese expansion had passed, but its effects still shaped every decision on both sides. Guadalcanal had become the crucible. What began as a preventive landing by US Marines in August had hardened into a campaign neither nation could abandon without consequence. The island's airfield, Henderson Field, was the anchor of the entire struggle. Whoever controlled it controlled daylight over the Eastern Solomons. Whoever held it dictated supply routes, reinforcement schedules, and the fate of troops dug into the island's jungle interior. By November, both sides understood that the outcome at Guadalcanal was no longer local. It carried strategic weight far beyond its muddy runways and palm-covered ridges. Japanese commanders were committed to retaking the airfield. Their supply convoys had been mauled for months by American aircraft, forcing a reliance on night operations, the Tokyo Express, destroyers racing down the slot to deliver men and ammunition. These runs kept the Japanese foothold alive, but could not deliver heavy support weapons or the quantities needed for decisive action. Each month stretched their resources thinner. Each failure to neutralize Henderson Field magnified pressure on the combined fleet. Washington, meanwhile, was fighting a different battle. America's industrial strength was beginning to emerge, but the frontline units in the Solomons were still fragile. Losses of cruisers at Savo Island, Cape Esperance, and the catastrophic night action on November 13th had thinned available forces to a critical point. Repairs lagged behind demand. Fuel, ammunition, and replacement ships were insufficient for comfort. Even as new carriers and battleships neared completion back home, the forces around Guadalcanal faced a present shaped by scarcity. The struggle for the night sky was equally decisive. Japanese naval doctrines still excelled in darkness. Their training emphasized coordinated night torpedo attacks, rapid maneuvering, and aggressive ranging by optical sights. Their Type 93 long-lance torpedoes were the most lethal in the world, and their commanders trusted these weapons to reshape any engagement before American guns could dominate. The United States Navy approached night fighting differently. Scarred by earlier defeats, American commanders shifted toward radar-dependent tactics. The technology was new, imperfect, and often misunderstood, but its advantages were undeniable: early detection, longer range, and the ability to track enemy movements before visual contact. By November, the Americans were learning to align radar data with gunnery solutions in real time. It was not yet doctrine, but the capability was emerging. The events of November 13th sharpened the urgency. A Japanese bombardment group had clashed with US cruisers and destroyers in a brutal close-range engagement that left ships burning and crews shattered. Although the Japanese suffered significant losses, they had inflicted heavy damage and remained determined to finish the mission. Henderson Field survived, but only barely. Intelligence made clear that another bombardment force was assembling. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo was assigned to deliver the decisive strike. His task was to silence the airfield long enough for Japanese transports to land reinforcements and equipment. That meant sending a battleship, Kirishima, to ensure destruction where cruisers had previously fallen short. Around her, cruisers and destroyers would form the shield necessary to break through the unseen American line guarding the island. In response, the United States assembled Task Force 64 under Rear Admiral Willis. His flagship, USS Washington, carried advanced radar and a crew drilled in its integration with heavy gun fire control. Beside her sailed USS South Dakota, powerful but troubled by intermittent electrical issues. 4 destroyers formed the screening line ahead of the battleships, a fragile barrier against Japanese torpedoes. As the two forces moved through the Solomons, the sea and sky offered no hint of the coming clash. The distances were small. The destroyers, Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwyn, formed the forward edge of this formation, spaced to provide early warning and absorb the initial shock of Japanese torpedoes. Their crews were aware that the larger ships behind them needed the first critical minutes of detection to bring their main batteries into action. Their role was vital and dangerous. Japanese doctrine assumed that any American presence would be detected only visually, if at all, and that destroyers could outrun or outmaneuver opposing forces long enough for Kirishima to reach bombardment range. Tokyo Express commanders had been operating through the slot for months and believed their experience in these waters gave them a near-perfect understanding of American predictability. But the Americans now had a different advantage. Radar contact allowed Lee to track approaching ships through darkness and rain long before the first silhouettes appeared. The SG radar aboard Washington registered contacts with clarity at ranges far exceeding Japanese expectations. This early detection was not yet flawless. Operators needed to interpret returns, compare signals, and refine solutions. But it offered something unprecedented: time. As the two forces moved toward Guadalcanal, the atmospheric conditions matched those of many earlier night engagements: shifting currents, low cloud ceilings, and intermittent rain. These elements had favored Japanese optics in prior battles, reducing visibility for American lookouts and complicating coordination. Now, however, those same conditions served as a cloak for U.S. movements, concealing the precise position of Lee's battleships, while radar tracked the advancing enemy. The distance between fleets narrowed. Kondo's formation, stretched to cover both bombardment and protection, began making the turns necessary to enter Iron Bottom Sound. Destroyers moved ahead to scout. Cruisers shifted into supporting positions. Kirishima advanced with the confidence of a ship whose design and crew were built for this style of combat. Task Force 64 moved quietly, maintaining strict control over lighting, radio emissions, and maneuvering. At the center of the formation, plotting teams evaluated radar returns, calculated speeds, and built a picture of enemy movements that no American force in the Solomon Islands had previously possessed with such clarity. By the time both fleets approached engagement range, the tactical landscape had fundamentally changed. Japanese commanders still believed that their strength lay in surprise and night vision. The Americans now relied on a different kind of vision, one that extended through weather and darkness, allowing them to track enemy ships with a precision unavailable to the human eye. The stage was set for the confrontation that would test each doctrine. Radar would meet optics, battleship would meet battleship. The fragile equilibrium of night combat in the Pacific was about to shift, bringing new angles into the narrative that defined this pivotal moment. The crews who sailed into Iron Bottom Sound that night carried the accumulated strain of a campaign defined by attrition. On USS Washington, many of the sailors had been at sea for months, rotating between drills, maintenance, and the tense, quiet hours where nothing happened except anticipation. Their lives followed the rhythm of steel corridors, humming machinery, and orders delivered in precise language. By November 14th, they understood the stakes of every movement near Guadalcanal. The loss of cruisers earlier in the week had circulated through the fleet in clipped messages and personal accounts, each one a reminder of the violence waiting in the dark. Inside the plotting rooms, radar operators worked under dim red lighting, their concentration locked onto the screens that translated unseen movements into data. They were young, many in their early 20s, but trained to treat the returns not as abstractions, but as threats. Each blip represented a ship with guns, torpedoes, and its own crew fighting the same fragile balance between discipline and fear. Their responsibility was clear: feed accurate information to the fire control teams. A wrong range estimate could cost lives. On the Japanese side, Sailors aboard Kirishima and her escorts moved with the familiarity of crews accustomed to night battle. Their training emphasized rapid reaction, precision with optical instruments, and confidence in torpedoes capable of killing at distances far beyond American expectation. Their fatigue ran deeper than the Americans. Months of Tokyo Express runs, constant maneuvering, and shortages of food and supplies had worn them down. Still, there was pride, an understanding of their Navy's mastery of night fighting. They believed in their methods, because experience had validated them repeatedly. The human experience of that night was not shaped by adrenaline alone, but by the disciplined awareness that every action carried weight. Those on watch stood in silence, listening to engines, wind, and faint orders. Uncertainty hung over every deck. Before radar and torpedoes, before doctrine and machinery, the battle depended on thousands of individuals, performing their roles without hesitation. They were separate crews on separate oceans of darkness, bound by the same inevitability of the clash approaching. That convergence formed the emotional anchor of the battle, setting the ground for the deeper forces shaping the encounter. The most profound difference between the two forces was not in gunnery or armor, but in perception. American ships carried radar systems that could identify, track, and measure targets invisible to the naked eye. The SG surface search radar aboard Washington was the most advanced in the Pacific theater at that time. It scanned the surrounding waters with clarity unaffected by weather, haze, or moonlight. When radar operators marked contacts, they provided ranges and bearings in real time, allowing fire control computers to construct firing solutions before the enemy had any visual confirmation of American presence. This represented a departure from every major surface engagement fought earlier in the Solomons, where American cruisers had previously been surprised by Japanese formations appearing suddenly out of the dark. Washington now saw first. Radar did not just detect ships, it granted minutes, precious minutes, for analysis, positioning, and preparation. Japanese technology excelled in a different domain. Their optical rangefinders were superb, capable of fine adjustments and long-distance accuracy, under conditions of adequate visibility. Their crews were trained intensely in night optics, skilled in reading faint silhouettes and muzzle flashes. Their torpedoes, the Type 93 Long Lance, used oxygen propulsion to achieve extraordinary range and speed, without leaving telltale trails. These weapons were decisive in earlier battles and remained a lethal threat, but optical systems required visibility and time to identify targets. Torpedoes required precise firing angles based on sighting. Radar did not. It fed instant information into systems that could calculate firing angles before the Japanese even realized a battleship was within range. The technological divide created an asymmetry. The Americans entered the battle with a new kind of situational awareness. The Japanese relied on mastery of skills that had dominated until this night. The dividing line between these systems marked the transition from one era of naval warfare to another, shaping every moment of the confrontation that followed. The decisions made by the commanders on each side reflected contrasting philosophies shaped by their experiences and available tools. Rear Admiral Willis, commanding Task Force 64, was a gunnery expert with an analytical mind. He approached naval combat through data, precision, and disciplined control. Radar was not simply equipment, it was a method. Lee trusted the readings, trusted the procedures his crews practiced, and trusted that early information would offset earlier American disadvantages in night combat. His doctrine was straightforward: maintain cohesion, trust radar, limit unnecessary maneuvers, and strike with accuracy once firing solutions were verified. He did not seek visual engagement, he sought decisive, calculated fire based on electronic vision. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo operated within a doctrine forged by success in night battles. His experience in the Pacific validated aggressive tactics, closing distance quickly, using destroyers to launch torpedoes, and employing battleships for overwhelming bombardment. Kondo expected American resistance, but believed his formation could overwhelm it through coordination and speed. His ships were arranged to protect Kirishima long enough for her to reach firing range of Henderson Field. Kondo's belief in traditional night fighting doctrine was reasonable based on prior outcomes, but it contained an assumption. that the Americans would detect him late, react slowly, and suffer from confusion. This assumption no longer matched the capabilities of Task Force 64. The gap between doctrine and reality widened as the fleets approached each other. Leadership and doctrine did not merely shape movements. They defined the tempo at which both forces operated. One commander trusted technology to reveal the unseen. The other trusted experience and proven methods. Their convergence created the conditions for the tactical angles that unfolded next. The arrangement of ships within Iron Bottom Sound on the night of November 14 defined the tactical story long before the first shells fell. Task Force 64 advanced in a formation built around controlled movement. The destroyers formed a thin screen, spaced to intercept or at least detect Japanese destroyers attempting torpedo attacks. Behind them, Washington and South Dakota followed on parallel paths at a steady pace. Their goal was not to seek a melee, but to maintain a configuration where radar inputs translated into clean firing arcs. Japanese movements reflected their intent to break through. Their destroyers advanced first, angled for torpedo opportunities the moment any American force revealed itself. Behind them, cruisers moved in staggered columns, prepared to shield Kirishima during the approach. The goal was to keep the battleship free to complete the bombardment mission. Their formation carried speed, cohesion, and a degree of confidence rooted in earlier victories. But the tactical geometry was shifting in ways the Japanese could not see. Washington's radar tracked multiple groups, identifying which contacts moved independently and which maintained formation. This allowed Admiral Lee to visualize the approaching force long before it came into view. The Americans could refine angles, maintain distance, and avoid sudden maneuvers that would complicate fire control. The Japanese assumed they retained the initiative typical of night battles. In previous engagements, American ships reacted only after enemy silhouettes appeared through the dark. Tonight, the geometry inverted. The Americans held the informational high ground. They could maneuver with purpose rather than instinct. This asymmetry created an invisible tactical advantage that would become decisive once the engagement began. The Americans entered the confrontation knowing more about the battlefield than their opponents, shaping the moment when the enemy's confidence in torpedo dominance would collide with prepared firing solutions. From this geometry came the foundation of the conflict's most critical minutes. Japanese naval doctrine had earned its reputation through repeated results. At Savo Island, at Tasafaronga, and across multiple Tokyo Express engagements, Japanese destroyers had outmaneuvered American cruisers, launched torpedo strikes with devastating accuracy, and disappeared back into the night. Their crews were conditioned to expect hesitation from American commanders, miscommunication among American formations, and limited coordination during chaotic night encounters. These assumptions shaped the mindset aboard Kirishima. Japanese officers believed the Americans lacked the training and coordination to employ large ships effectively at night. Their past experiences showed American fire often poorly directed, their formations fractured under pressure and their visibility compromised by inexperience in low-light conditions. Confidence in these expectations was not misplaced. It reflected the realities of earlier battles. But confidence created a blind spot. The Japanese did not anticipate that the Americans would commit battleships equipped with advanced radar to a night operation. They did not expect the Americans to maintain formation discipline under darkness. They did not expect to be detected before they detected the enemy. Most critically, they did not expect their approach to be tracked minute by minute. The Japanese miscalculation was not in their skill, but in their assumptions. They approached Iron Bottom Sound prepared to encounter the familiar. Instead, they moved into a battle space transformed by technology and new tactics. Their doctrine had not accounted for radar-directed fire that could strike accurately at ranges beyond visual detection. This misalignment between expectation and reality was not immediately visible, but it shaped every decision as their ships moved closer. The Japanese entered the engagement with confidence in familiar patterns. The Americans waited with the advantage of unseen awareness. That divergence set the stage for the critical pressure point of the coming battle. Beyond ships, technology, and tactics, the battle carried moral pressure anchored to the landmass whose fate both sides sought to control. Henderson Field was more than an airstrip. It represented survival for the American forces on Guadalcanal. Every supply convoy, Every defensive perimeter and every daylight sortie depended on its operation. If Japanese forces disabled it even for one night, reinforcements could land in strength, altering the strategic balance on the island. The field was the hinge on which the campaign turned. For the Americans, the knowledge that Henderson Field remained vulnerable shaped their determination. The men aboard Washington and South Dakota understood that failure to stop the Japanese bombardment would ripple through every front line on the island. Marines in foxholes, pilots in revetments, mechanics maintaining aircraft, each depended on the battleships in those dark waters. For the Japanese, destroying the airfield meant restoring strategic initiative. Their soldiers fighting inland lacked supplies, artillery, and reinforcement. A successful bombardment would allow transports to deliver everything needed to break the stalemate. The weight of their mission extended beyond fleet doctrine. It tied directly to the survival of their ground forces. This moral dimension sharpened the resolve on both sides. The crews were not fighting for abstract objectives but for immediate consequences. The battle carried a clarity unusual in war. If the Japanese succeeded, Guadalcanal would shift irreversibly in their favor. If the Americans succeeded, the Japanese position would weaken beyond recovery. This shared understanding of stakes created pressure greater than the mechanics of navigation or gunnery. It defined the urgency behind every action and set the emotional backdrop for the moment when radar, doctrine, and determination converged into the decisive turning point that followed. The arrangement of ships within Iron Bottom Sound on the night of November 14th defined the tactical story long before the first shells fell. Task Force 64 advanced in a formation built around controlled movement. The destroyers formed a thin screen, spaced to intercept or at least detect Japanese destroyers attempting torpedo attacks. Behind them, Washington and South Dakota followed on parallel paths at a steady pace. Their goal was not to seek a melee, but to maintain a configuration where radar inputs translated into clean firing arcs. Japanese movements reflected their intent to break through. Their destroyers advanced first, angled for torpedo opportunities the moment any American force revealed itself. Behind them, cruisers moved in staggered columns, prepared to shield Kirishima during the approach. The goal was to keep the battleship free to complete the bombardment mission. Their formation carried speed, cohesion, and a degree of confidence rooted in earlier victories. But the tactical geometry was shifting in ways the Japanese could not see. Washington's radar tracked multiple groups, identifying which contacts moved independently and which maintained formation. This allowed Admiral Lee to visualize the approaching force long before it came into view. The Americans could refine angles, maintain distance, and avoid sudden maneuvers that would complicate fire control. The Japanese assumed they retained the initiative typical of night battles. In previous engagements, American ships reacted only after enemy silhouettes appeared through the dark. Tonight, the geometry inverted. The Americans held the informational high ground. They could maneuver with purpose rather than instinct. This asymmetry created an invisible tactical advantage that would become decisive once the engagement began. The Americans entered the confrontation knowing more about the battlefield than their opponents, shaping the moment when the enemy's confidence in torpedo dominance would collide with prepared firing solutions. From this geometry came the foundation of the conflict's most critical minutes. Japanese naval doctrine had earned its reputation through repeated results. At Savo Island, at Tasafaronga, and across multiple Tokyo Express engagements, Japanese destroyers had outmaneuvered American cruisers, launched torpedo strikes with devastating accuracy, and disappeared back into the night. Their crews were conditioned to expect hesitation from American commanders, miscommunication among American formations, and limited coordination during chaotic night encounters. These assumptions shaped the mindset aboard Kirishima. Japanese officers believed the Americans lacked the training and coordination to employ large ships effectively at night. Their past experiences showed American fire often poorly directed, their formations fractured under pressure, and their visibility compromised by inexperience in low-light conditions. Confidence in these expectations was not misplaced. It reflected the realities of earlier battles. But confidence created a blind spot. The Japanese did not anticipate that the Americans would commit battleships equipped with advanced radar to a night operation. They did not expect the Americans to maintain formation discipline under darkness. They did not expect to be detected before they detected the enemy. Most critically, they did not expect their approach to be tracked minute by minute. The Japanese miscalculation was not in their skill but in their assumptions. They approached Iron Bottom Sound prepared to encounter the familiar. Instead, they moved into a battle space transformed by technology and new tactics. Their doctrine had not accounted for radar-directed fire that could strike accurately at ranges beyond visual detection. This misalignment between expectation and reality was not immediately visible, but it shaped every decision as their ships moved closer. The Japanese entered the engagement with confidence in familiar patterns. The Americans waited with the advantage of unseen awareness. That divergence set the stage for the critical pressure point of the coming battle. Beyond ships, technology, and tactics, the battle carried moral pressure anchored to the landmass whose fate both sides sought to control. Henderson Field was more than an airstrip. It represented survival for the American forces on Guadalcanal. Every supply convoy, every defensive perimeter, and every daylight sortie depended on its operation. If Japanese forces disabled it even for one night, reinforcements could land in strength, altering the strategic balance on the island. The field was the hinge on which the campaign turned. For the Americans, the knowledge that Henderson Field remained vulnerable shaped their determination. The men aboard Washington and South Dakota understood that failure to stop the Japanese bombardment would ripple through every front line on the island. Marines in foxholes, pilots in revetments, mechanics maintaining aircraft. Each depended on the battleships in those dark waters. For the Japanese, destroying the airfield meant restoring strategic initiative. Their soldiers fighting inland lacked supplies, artillery, and reinforcement. A successful bombardment would allow transports to deliver everything needed to break the stalemate. The weight of their mission extended beyond fleet doctrine. It tied directly to the survival of their ground forces. This moral dimension sharpened the resolve on both sides. The crews were not fighting for abstract objectives, but for immediate consequences. The battle carried a clarity unusual in war. If the Japanese succeeded, Guadalcanal would shift irreversibly in their favor. If the Americans succeeded, the Japanese position would weaken beyond recovery. This shared understanding of stakes created pressure greater than the mechanics of navigation or gunnery. It defined the urgency behind every action, and set the emotional backdrop for the moment when radar, doctrine, and determination converged into the decisive turning point that followed. The moment USS Washington opened fire marked the split second when the tactical and technological realities of the night reversed the assumptions that had guided Japanese doctrine for decades. Her first full salvo, directed by radar with calculated precision, crossed the dark waters in arcs of orange light. The shells traveled with a velocity that collapsed distance into seconds. When they struck as if the sea itself had erupted. Kirishima absorbed the first hits before her crew fully understood where the fire was coming from. The accuracy stunned them. Shells tore through her superstructure, detonating around her turrets and penetrating deep into the engineering spaces. Fire leaped from ruptured fuel and shattered equipment. Men who had trained for night battles their entire careers found themselves unable to see the ship that was killing them. No optical system could locate the source in time. Washington remained concealed in darkness, firing through radar solutions that updated continuously with each salvo. Admiral Lee maintained control through calm, uninterrupted data flow. Washington's plotting teams tracked every movement, adjusting for speed, bearing, and evasive action. The Mark 8 radar kept feeding refined measurements. Each salvo tightened the pattern. This was not the chaotic gunnery of earlier Pacific battles. It was measured, relentless, and brutally effective. Japanese destroyers attempted to counterattack, pushing forward to launch torpedoes at the unseen enemy. But Washington's fire was already crippling the battle line. Kirishima's steering jammed, her crew shifted to manual control, fighting to keep the ship angled for a reply. Her attempts to bring main batteries onto a firing solution faltered as damage spread. Fires grew on the decks. Compartments filled with smoke. Communications failed in sections of the ship. Officers moved through choking heat, shouting orders that struggled against the growing cacophony of collapsing metal. The American destroyers, though battered and burning from earlier exchanges, added to the confusion. Their earlier sacrifice had drawn Japanese attention and torpedoes at the onset of the engagement, creating the separation Washington needed to operate freely. The cost had been severe, ships hit, crews lost, but their actions allowed Lee's battleships to reach the critical moment intact. Meanwhile, South Dakota struggled under electrical failures. Darkness engulfed her internal systems, and she drifted into Japanese searchlights. The enemy's cruisers and remaining destroyers focused on her silhouette, believing they had caught the primary American capital ship. Shells raked her sides, knocking out radar, damaging superstructure and igniting fires. The barrage was intense, but her armor held. South Dakota's ordeal served a strategic purpose. It drew Japanese fire away from Washington, preserving the ship that carried the decisive radar-directed guns. Kirishima attempted to fight back. Her surviving gunners fired by instinct and flashes of light, but the disparity in awareness was overwhelming. Washington fired from ranges where the Japanese could not correctly determine her position. Each salvo tore deeper into the battleship's hull. Water began flooding through shattered bulkheads. Fires reached ammunition stores. Damage control teams worked under conditions where every action demanded urgency, but the spread of destruction moved faster than their ability to contain it. As Washington closed the distance, her salvos increased in intensity. Shells smashed through Kirishima's armor belt, twisted turrets from their bearings and ruptured machinery essential for propulsion. The Japanese battleship lost the ability to maintain speed or steering. Flames illuminated her silhouette across the water. The confidence that had defined the Japanese approach gave way to a stark realization. They were under attack from a ship they could neither see nor stop. The destroyer escorts attempted to shield Kirishima, but their efforts collided with the growing chaos. Some launched torpedoes at suspected American positions, but none found their mark. Others maneuvered to rescue crew as the battleship listed. The water around the ship shimmered with burning oil, broken equipment, and the distorted glow of fires reflecting across the waves. Washington continued firing until Admiral Lee confirmed the target was finished. There was no triumph in the final salvo, only the execution of necessity. As Kirishima drifted, her hull consumed by flames, the Japanese command structure unraveled. Vice Admiral Kondo, recognizing the battle was lost and the bombardment impossible, ordered a retreat to preserve surviving ships. The night that Japan had expected to dominate had turned against them in a way no optical system could counter. Radar-defined combat revealed its full weight. Washington, still unscathed and largely unseen, moved through the night with deliberate calm. Her guns fell silent only when the threat had passed. By the time Kirishima's crew prepared to abandon ship, the waters of Iron Bottom Sound were illuminated by the glow of dying fires and shattered steel. The Japanese bombardment force had been broken. The sea, calm despite the destruction, carried the echoes of a battle that had reshaped the balance of power. Kirishima's end marked more than the loss of a battleship. It marked the moment when electronic vision surpassed the mastery of night-fighting tradition, the pivot that shaped the aftermath waiting in the hours ahead. The night's violence left the sea littered with wreckage and fire. Kirishima, the centerpiece of the Japanese bombardment force, burned with an intensity that could be seen from miles away. Explosions from her magazines punctuated the dark, scattering debris into the waves. The ship's destruction was total. A battleship sunk before the dawn, her hull splitting under the weight of American gunfire. Japanese destroyers that had advanced to screen her now withdrew in confusion, many suffering damage from salvos aimed at the formation, but missing in part due to chaotic maneuvering. Command and cohesion collapsed within minutes, leaving what remained of the force incapable of completing its mission against Henderson Field. American losses were comparatively light. Washington emerged without critical damage, her radar-directed firing proving decisive. South Dakota, despite earlier electrical issues, participated in the engagement, delivering supporting fire with heavy shell weight. Destroyers in the screen absorbed some minor damage from Japanese torpedo attempts, but none were lost. The tactical execution of radar-directed fire control demonstrated its capacity to offset traditional Japanese night-fighting advantages. Strategically, the result was immediate. Henderson Field remained operational, allowing American aircraft to continue interdiction of Japanese supply runs. The loss of Kirishima and the withdrawal of supporting Japanese forces ended the immediate threat to the island. the Japanese High Command faced the stark realization that their surface fleet, previously dominant in night combat, could no longer operate with impunity. The weight of months of attrition, exacerbated by the failure of this bombardment, forced a re-evaluation of surface tactics in the Solomons. Reports following the battle highlighted the psychological impact on both sides. American naval personnel recognized that radar had shifted the balance of night engagements. Confidence rose within the crews of Washington and South Dakota, validating months of training and investment in technology. Conversely, Japanese sailors experienced the sudden collapse of a doctrine they had trusted for years. The human cost of overconfidence became painfully evident. Officers who had expected to dominate the night were forced to witness the destruction of their battleship, under conditions they had believed favorable. Beyond immediate losses, the battle reshaped operational priorities. Japanese naval planners temporarily suspended major night bombardments, emphasizing instead cautious movements and air support. The failure of the mission to neutralize Henderson Field reinforced the necessity of combined arms rather than relying solely on night surface attacks. Conversely, American leadership began to integrate radar into doctrine more systematically, recognizing that the technology could redefine engagements previously dictated by visibility and gunnery skill alone. By morning, Iron Bottom Sound held the wreckage of a decisive moment. Fires smoldered, twisted metal floated, and bodies were recovered from the water. For Guadalcanal, the result meant continued American control of the airfield and the ability to project force into surrounding waters. For the Japanese, it signified a tactical and symbolic defeat whose consequences would resonate beyond this single engagement, affecting subsequent operations and the confidence of crews across the Pacific. The broader consequences of the engagement extended beyond immediate tactical outcomes. The loss of Kirishima marked the first time a Japanese battleship had been sunk by radar-directed gunfire in the Pacific, creating a stark validation of emerging American technology. Intelligence reports and after-action analyses confirmed the effectiveness of integrating radar with fire control systems, demonstrating that accuracy and early detection could decisively neutralize traditional night fighting advantages. This development accelerated the United States Navy's commitment to radar-based tactics across the theater, influencing training, deployment, and design decisions for months to come. Japanese Naval Command faced both material and psychological setbacks. The destruction of a capital ship and the failure to accomplish the primary objective undermined the perceived invincibility of the Japanese surface fleet at night. Crews who had been conditioned to dominate dark waters now questioned whether their doctrine remained relevant against modern detection technologies. Rear Admiral Kondo's withdrawal reflected not mere tactical prudence, but a recognition that assumptions underpinning Japanese night operations were no longer reliable. Subsequent Tokyo Express missions became more cautious, limiting exposure to direct confrontation and placing increased reliance on air superiority rather than surface engagement. The operational momentum shifted. Henderson Field remained under American control, allowing continuous air operations against Japanese shipping. Transport runs delivering troops, equipment, and supplies gained a protective advantage, benefiting from the psychological shock inflicted upon the Japanese command. The continued functionality of the airfield ensured that the American position on Guadalcanal was not only defended but increasingly fortified, tipping the island campaign toward eventual Allied success. Casualty reports underscored the scale of the engagement. Japanese losses included hundreds of sailors, the total loss of Kirishima, and damage to multiple destroyers and cruisers. American casualties were minimal in comparison, reinforcing the operational asymmetry created by radar-guided fire. Observers noted that while the battle was brief in duration, its intensity and clarity left a lasting imprint on both sides, shaping tactical thought, command confidence, and morale in equal measure. Strategically, the battle accelerated the decline of Japanese naval surface supremacy in the Solomon Islands. The loss of key assets, combined with the demonstrated effectiveness of American technology, constrained Japanese operational freedom. Decisions in Tokyo increasingly reflected caution, emphasizing survivability over aggressive night operations. For the United States, the success reinforced confidence in doctrine and technological investment. allowing commanders to experiment further with radar integration in subsequent operations across the Pacific. By the time the sun rose over Iron Bottom Sound, the immediate struggle had ended, but its reverberations were profound. The Japanese fleet retreated into waters still dominated by uncertainty and the threat of air attack. American forces, though battered by months of campaign attrition, recognized a new balance of power in which radar and disciplined gunnery could neutralize previously insurmountable night fighting advantages. The stage was set for future engagements where the integration of technology, human training, and doctrine would define outcomes far more decisively than raw numerical strength alone. The aftermath clarified one enduring truth: the night of November 14 to 15 had transformed naval combat in the Pacific. What followed was no longer merely a contest of ships and guns, but a contest of detection, anticipation, and the ability to act decisively on information unseen by the human eye. From this clarity emerged the reflective lens through which the battle would be remembered, setting the narrative for the final section. The engagement off Guadalcanal on the night of November 14 to 15, 1942, represents a pivot in the evolution of naval warfare. For decades, night combat had favored skill, training, and audacity, qualities long embodied by the Japanese Navy. The darkness offered concealment, torpedoes offered lethality, and human judgment determined outcomes. On this night, technology rewrote those rules. Radar granted the Americans sight beyond sight, a synthetic awareness that compressed uncertainty into actionable intelligence. The 7-minute window before the first guns fired was more than a measure of time. It was the crystallization of strategic advantage. It proved that preparation, integration, and trust in instrumentation could overcome traditional supremacy. USS Washington's main batteries, guided by electronic insight rather than the naked eye, demonstrated that information could serve as both shield and spear. The destruction of Kirishima did not merely neutralize a battleship. It signaled a transformation in the hierarchy of naval power. Beyond tactics and hardware, the battle carried a human and philosophical dimension. Sailors and officers confronted the immediacy of mortality within a framework increasingly dominated by abstraction, data, signals, calculations. The human cost remained, but the locus of decision-making had shifted. Mastery of technology became inseparable from courage, discipline, and precision. In broader terms, the night illuminated the fragility of assumptions once considered immutable. Japanese confidence in night fighting doctrine collided with the reality of radar-guided fire, accelerating a shift in Pacific strategy. American forces recognized that technological investment could reshape engagements, influence morale, and determine survival. Guadalcanal became a proving ground for a new era of naval warfare, one where visibility, speed, and experience were still vital, but where information became the decisive weapon. Ultimately, the battle underscored the interplay of preparation, innovation, and human endurance. The 7 minutes before the guns fired encapsulate a broader truth of war. Mastery lies not solely in strength or daring, but in the ability to perceive, anticipate, and act on realities invisible to the opponent. The night faded, but its lessons endured, shaping not only the outcome of the Solomons but the trajectory of naval conflict throughout the Pacific.